I hope you all hear me. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our session on quantity and quality assessment of sustainability impact assessments of trade agreements. I'm Elisabeth Buergi. I'm based at the Center for Development Environments, where I'm co-heading the research area sustainability governance. I have a legal background. I'm lecturing law and sustainability, and I have done lots of work on trade and sustainable development, including impact assessments. This session I did co-organize with Caroline Doman, and whom I'd like to thank you for all the work she has done so that we can be here today. Governments, when negotiating trade agreements, be it on the bilateral, plurilateral, or multilateral level, have a duty and in some cases even a legal obligation to frame those agreements in a way that they do not undermine, but rather support environmentally and socially friendly dynamics. Whether a trade agreement will be shaped in such a conducive way must be assessed before the trade pact is concluded in order to leave space for adjustments. Of course, evidence of impacts can only be established ex post once an agreement is in force. Ex ante, however, impacts can be estimated. How that is usually done in structured policymaking processes. In order to cope with this responsibility, several countries and trading partners have in recent years engaged in sustainability impact assessments of trade agreements. And in some cases in human rights, very specific human rights or environmental assessments. The EU, for instance, has undertaken such ex-ante assessments already since 1999. The US and Canada have undertaken ex-ante environmental assessments in several cases. Canada has undertaken ex-post human rights assessments of a range of agreements. Thailand has undertaken a human rights ex-ante assessment of the Thai-US draft agreement, or New Zealand does usually undertake national interest analysis to better assess the evidence and the impact of future trade agreements. Switzerland has recently committed to do so too. We will hear more about that later. Many international organizations and civil society organizations have also used the tool to bring new perspectives into trade negotiations, such as the UNEP, FIAN, Miserior, Public Eye, and others. Recent examples of methodological innovations have had a strong focus on gender analysis to address gender and inclusivity. See, for example, the Canada's Gender-Based Analysis Plus or the UNCTAD's Trade and Gender Toolbox. While the focus of these different assessments varies, they are regularly prone to criticism. If they are undertaken at a too late stage of negotiations, or if stakeholders' inclusion was not optimal, if the other trading partner has not undertaken the same exercise and the same time, if findings do not adequately inform the negotiations, or if the need to shape the agreements differently is not responded to, or if the focus is too narrow, too broad, etc. One major potential for improvement is regularly seen in the way assessments of impacts are undertaken by the methodologies that are applied, while guidelines usually claim that both qualitative and quantitative approaches should be combined in a very wise and intelligent way. Much uncertainty is still out there on how this can be done in an optimal way in order to capture all vulnerabilities linked to trade flows, and in order to take not only an aggregate but also a disaggregated perspective. This session today will focus on these methodological challenges and discuss how qualitative and quantitative approaches can be combined in order to get to optimal results. We have 3 speakers and 2 discussants on the panel, to whom I will give the floor first. Afterwards, I will open to the audience. Please raise your hand and come in by unmuting yourself, or put your question and comment in the chat. Thank you. Before I hand over to the first speaker, I'd like to thank the organizers, IISD, for hosting this wonderful and very inspiring hub, and to all that made this session here possible. Now with this, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, who is perfectly suited to explain us what it means to use economic modeling in sustainability impact assessments. Joe Francois is Managing Director and Professor of Economics at the World Trade Institute in Bern, Switzerland. He is a Fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research and co-director of the European Trade Study Group, among other affiliations. Joe is one of the experts worldwide in quantitative impact assessments of trade agreements and in applying CGE models to that agreements. He has recently led a study for the Swiss government to assess certain environmental impacts of the EFTA Mercosur agreement. Joe, could you please briefly explain what a CGE model is, what the mandate was with the EFTA Mercosur agreement, how you applied the model, where you see strengths and weaknesses, and if you may say also a word on the findings of the study. Joe, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to try and share screen here if this works. Hold on. Share. Okay, that's working okay, I hope. Good. All right, so thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I've been involved in what used to be just impact assessments and then sustainability impact assessments. I'll admit probably since the, oh, geez, I think it's maybe 30 years. I've led the modeling teams for about 3/4 of the EU assessments on different trade agreements that used to be just economic impact and then mutated into or grew into sustainability impact assessments. So it's with that as context in terms of starting out here. Yeah, I'm not going to go through technical details on what a CGE model is, but in broad conceptual terms, what it is and how we use it. And we are actually integrating it now with the second set of tools. And so I'll talk briefly about both of those. CGE models, or computational general equilibrium models, they trace through linkages across sectors and across countries, right? You have value chains built into the data. You have third country response to trade agreements. They allow it to look at basically different elements of a trade agreement across many sectors and many countries at the same time. And the reason that this has become, in a sense, the default tool is because these agreements are big. They cover lots of things. And if you go piece by piece, you miss what turns out to be important aspects of the interaction between sectors. They compete for resources, they buy things from third countries, and you really want to have those in there. And we'll see that in a minute here. Building on the same sets of data, a new set of tools that's being used to look at these things is what's called multi-region input-output analysis. Okay, now input-output analysis actually dates back to the first or second Nobel Prize in economics. It's the Leontief stuff is really old, but the data we have now globally is new. Okay, and what this lets us do is trace through resource profiles. For example, if we look at Argentine production of metals that may be sold to Switzerland, what goes into that? Where does that come from? You know, what types of resources, what kinds of sustainability impacts do we have measures of? And what we're doing now, what I'll talk about briefly here in my remaining 5 minutes, I guess, is how we integrate these two things. Okay, so basically combining this value chain analysis with the computational modeling of what the impact of an agreement might be. Also, it turns out that this assessment, this sort of preview before you run models of what the linkages are across sectors and countries is important when you want to identify priority sectors in terms of what might happen, right? Or sectors in terms of where it might be good to add language on technology transfer or other incentives to ensure that things go right and not wrong with resource use. And so in that sense, combining these two helps us identify where, again, upstream technology might be useful. Also unintended consequences where things may happen you didn't think would happen, which is one of the reasons actually we run these models. We see a good unintended consequence here, but it could run the other way. I'll mention that at the very end in my last minute or so. And also this type of analysis may help. And so there's ongoing work of looking at how the supply chain in this sense is attached to food security and flow of resources in that sense as well, where calories come from. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about the SECO study. One of our contributions in the study was coming up with an acronym, which is MFDA, the EFTA Mercosur FTA. The mandate here, unlike the other SIAs that I've been involved in, was to look strictly at kind of the quantifiable sustainability dimensions only on environment. Okay, so we were explicitly asked not to focus on socioeconomic dimensions. This reflects in part the dynamics, I think, within Bern, within the capital, in terms of interested parties deciding who is looking at what, right? And it's also true in the case of where the EC is now with their sustainability impact assessments. There was a complicated agreement that kind of had to be reached between the directorates in terms of who's in charge of what with agriculture and trade and so on, and then collectively how that process would run. The agreement itself involved both tariff reductions and trade costs that are non-tariff reductions, or what's called non-tariff measures, NTMs. The context is important because the EU, when they signed an agreement with Mercosur, it followed having suspended GSP preferences. Okay, and so they were kind of trying to get back market access conditions that they'd had. With the EFTA agreement, on the other hand, GSP was still in place. And so in a sense, the bargaining was about trying to make sure that they didn't lose the access conditions they already had. Okay, so there were concessions to Swiss exporters. There were not many concessions on the EFTA side. Some exceptions, textiles and clothing were expanded a bit. Also, in terms of, for example, things that fall in under some of these lists of environmentally sensitive goods, there wasn't much of a change. So beef, which was a big area of discussion early on, in the EU agreement, there's expansion of quotas and there's all the effects that come with that, methane and deforestation and so on. Whereas it turns out that with this agreement, with the Mercosur EFTA agreement or EMFTA, the beef quotas are basically held fixed, right? So that's a big difference. And there was a lot of discussion and worry about the impact of things like beef before the guts of the agreement were released to the public. And it would have made sense, forget the modeling stuff, just to let the public know early on what the content of the agreement was. It would have, I think, helped people focus a bit more in terms of the work that was done to support the public policy debate. Okay, so almost there. So with CG models, in a sense, what we do here, on the right-hand side, I have a list in our modeling of the environmental indicators that we had. And as Lisa had mentioned, these are things we can quantify. So we have linkages between economic activity, say fuel being burned, land being used, and so on in the range of emissions. Some are related to air pollution, some are resource use, some are greenhouse gases. And essentially with the change in economic activity, which the model is designed to capture, we then in turn get changes in the environmental indicators, okay, that are driven by that. And that's the reason for using the model. If you want to take a 2-week course, I can send you somewhere to do the math and stuff. But in essence, the question is non-technically, okay, if we impose this agreement on the world economy, what changes, right? And what does that give us? And so we're trying to get these quantifiable numbers. On the MRIO stuff, on top of that, then takes these value chain linkages, and we can then identify where things are burned or used or cut down or whatever, and where they go to. So here's an example that we've done with methane, looking at where it comes from and then where it ends up. And this goes through different stages in production. Okay, and these two things together, the modeling and then this tracking of resource flows and pollution and so on, together helps us then understand quantifiably what some of the impacts of or sustainability impacts of an agreement are. In the case of, just as an example here, so for Argentina then, on the left, on the vertical axis, what we've got is the shares of overall emissions for methane. Okay, and you can see that indeed one sector does dominate. That sector is indeed beef. Okay, but then on the vertical axis, you've got the changes in output. Again, because the TRQs are largely unchanged. And so in this case, we've got some sectors that are dominant. They're the ones you want to focus on. On the other hand, then we see what happens in those sectors, and it turns out not so much, right? But that's strictly because of this agreement and the way this agreement was set up. At least I'll be done in about 2 more slides. So
yeah, 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and then here, so this is then for Mercosur for all the changes that result for the 4 economies aggregated together, right? In terms of where the emissions are and the changes in output. And again, there isn't that much of a change in output for the sectors that are highly sensitive. There are big changes in some, but those sectors tend to be relatively small. And this then is where we're using these linkages. So it's not just the direct emissions from a sector burning stuff. It's also because they use, say, inputs that have land, or that those input sectors also burn things. Okay, so in my last 35 seconds or whatever. One thing that showed up here is what I'll call impact diversion. And it's another reason for using the modeling here, is that there was a lot of adjustment in relative terms in third countries to what happened between the EFTA economies and Mercosur. And that adjustment meant that of those changes in emissions we identified, about half were offset by changes in activity in third countries. And you miss that when you just go sector by sector in a lot of detail, right? So while there's great merit to looking at stuff in detail, this broad impact, it turns out, is important. Also, that could cut the other way, right? It could be that directly you don't see much, but indirectly there's a lot of increases in emissions because you sign an agreement with, say, Vietnam, and they source a lot of stuff from China, and Chinese emissions go up. Okay, so you can't say immediately which direction that goes in, but those third country effects, the sort of impact diversion, whether it's emissions, pollution, deforestation, those things, it turns out, matter. These linkages across sectors matter. And I guess just in terms of, so there was earlier work on the EMFTA, a lot of which was worried about much more sort of ambitious changes in market access, including beef. And it would have been useful there if the public had known earlier on what the agreement was going to look like. And this goes back to Lisa's point that these things should be done initially before you start, right? We should know what the negotiating parameters are. In a sense, it helps identify what those parameters will be. But then after the things are framed, I think you want to go back a second time and take a look. But going back and looking at this afterwards, that doesn't really help. And the last, just an anecdote, and then I'll stop. So in NAFTA, way back when, I ran that assessment too, by the way, for the US. So the NAFTA assessments, the US waited until the agreement was done and signed and dusted. And then they went to the economists and said, please analyze this, we need to sell it. Okay, whereas both in Ottawa and in Mexico City, the governments had these PhD, these Chicago trained economists that were running models in real time during the negotiations, trying to find what the optimal outcome might be, right? So you had one where you don't bother to use any of these assessments, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, or whether it's model-based or not, until the lawyers are done. And in the second set of negotiating teams, they were doing it in real time as they went along, trying to frame things. Is this good? Is this bad? Should we do this? Do we want to front load, back load that? And that makes sense. So I agree, this stuff should be done also for the negotiating teams. In a sense, it makes sense to be doing this stuff in real time and not to just wait until the special interests negotiate for stuff and then try to see if it's okay or not. Okay, I'll stop now. So let me unshare here.
Yes, please. Thank you very much, Jo. It's really demanding to explain the modeling approach in a few
7
minutes.
slides.
So I gave you a little bit of more time, but thank you very much for having done a great job in doing that. With that, I'd like to directly hand over to Marcia Fontana. Marcia Fontana is a feminist economist with over 20 years of research and teaching experience at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University. Her main research interests are inequalities, labour markets, international trade, and unpaid work. Marcia has contributed extensively to the field of gender equality and trade policies and gender-aware macroeconomic modelling. Marcia, if you could explain why you recommend to integrate qualitative and quantitative approaches in SIAs, how we could improve this integration, and how modelers could try to better take into account insights from both qualitative research and other types of empirical work in the design of their model. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this conversation. I'd like to start with a general point, which is already being raised by Elisabeth, and then follow with a few concrete examples that draw on my experience of carrying out gender analysis of trade using CGE methodologies, which are mostly at the single country level. And by the way, when I started to learn about CGE models more than 20 years ago, Joe Francois's green book on applied methods for trade policy analysis was really a Bible. We all recognize that it is important that sustainable impact assessment are as comprehensive as possible and include a variety of dimensions, the social, the environmental, human rights, and so on, and use a combination of methodologies to examine these multiple dimensions. Progress has been made in this direction in recent practice. However, answering Elisabeth's question, I think we can do much better. And we could improve certainly on the way the qualitative and the quantitative are integrated. In particular, I like us to encourage greater use of what in research we call a mixed methods approach, where the quantitative and the qualitative are not simply used side by side, but still living somewhat in parallel universes, but are fully integrated. So what does this full integration mean from the point of view of a quantitative economist such as myself? It means listening more seriously to the rich insights coming from disciplines other than economics, including qualitative research, and let these insights guide us when we design quantitative survey questions, when we choose diagnostic indicators, and also when we decide how to modify the structure and the assumptions of a CG model to answer questions on distributional effects of policies. I'm not suggesting that we should try to quantify everything. This is a conversation I've been having with Caroline. But I strongly feel that existing quantitative analysis need to be more in tune and include more qualitative dimensions, because otherwise, if we keep the quantitative and the qualitative as separate segments in an impact assessment, we risk to perpetuate a false dichotomy between the economic and the social. This distinction, in my view, is artificial because the economic is rooted in the social, and the social has economic dimensions. Now, to make these points a bit more concrete, I like to use two examples referring to CGE methodologies. As a reminder, CGE models describe the functioning of an entire economy or various economies if they are multi-country. They include the behavior of firms, workers, and households. They consider linkages between different sectors, which is a great strength of this modeling approach. And they are used to simulate alternative policy scenarios. Of the two examples, one example is negative, pointing to what I think we should do differently. and the other is positive. I leave the positive one for last because it's always good to end on a good note. So the first example regards the way in which models usually deal with the distributional effects that trade can have on consumption. Trade can change the prices, quantity, quality of food or other essential items such as medicines. And these can have gender-specific effects. There's a long-standing body of literature, both qualitative and quantitative, that has documented gender differences in relation to food. Men and women tend to have different diets, for example, but this is not the most important thing. The most important thing is that many households are characterized by an unequal distribution of resources and responsibilities along gender lines. And for example, purchasing food, preparing food is almost invariably all over the world a responsibility that falls on women. And in some society, when food is limited, gender norms dictate who eats first. And yet, despite this compelling evidence, most models that I know continue, this is just CG models and other type of modeling approaches, continue to use the approach of treating the household as a homogeneous unit, allowing no difference whatsoever between household members in the way they are likely to experience changes in the overall availability of food. The few exercises that I've seen and that try to include gender dimensions in the modeling of consumption effects related to trade do so by differentiating between female-headed households and male-headed households, but this approach misses the point and can lead to misleading results. I like to explain this better, but I do not have time, and therefore I move to my second example. So now I like to highlight another dimensions of the gender effects of trade in which progress made in CGE model design is more promising. This is about the ways in which CGE models describe the functioning of the labor market. Over the years, CG models have started to provide more realistic representations by allowing a set of rigidities and imperfections in the labor market. And in particular, some CG models, or not all, although definitely not all of them, allow for differences between different types of workers, both on the demand side, for example, the existence of gender-based sectoral segmentation, and the supply side, for example, representing women's more limited ability to take up paid employment because of, for example, childcare responsibilities. To make this point clearer, I would like to refer briefly to a regional CG model that's been developed by the ILO and ADB, including 6 countries in the Asian region. This model is used to simulate the effects of a number of economic integration initiatives on different categories of workers. And for this purpose, workers are disaggregated not only by gender, but also by occupation and skill. This model finds that in Vietnam, for instance, under all scenarios, women gain more than men in terms of employment opportunities. But the more interesting finding is that these gains mostly come from an increase in low-skilled jobs. In addition, the model also shows that the gender wage gap is actually widening. So the value of this specific model design resides in the fact that because the modelers have chosen to disaggregate labor categories, not only by gender, but also by skill, this enables us to capture employment effects that relate not just to the quantity of jobs, that we will say, well, there's more jobs for women, but also to the quality of these jobs, which in fact, in this case, is not that good. And so this leads to conclusions that are more nuanced than the simplistic story that we often hear that trade is good for women's employment, and therefore can help to think of the wider menu of policies that are needed in order to maximize women's gains from trade. There would be so much more to talk about, but I'm aware that time is over, and so I stop here. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Marcia. This was very enlightening, and how you showed how the models can be adapted in way in order to respond also to disaggregate, to allow to have a disaggregate perspective. I can't spell this term, so I'm sorry. On the ground, to make them more nuanced, the insights more nuanced and more disaggregates. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Caroline Doman. Caroline is an independent researcher, analyst, and writer on sustainability law, policy and practice. Her main focus is on social justice and equity in international trade. And Caroline is also a senior associate with IISD. And she's one of the experts now on human rights and gender assessments, impact assessments of trade agreement, and has contributed to a range of significant studies that are out there. Caroline, what does it mean to apply a human rights approach to an SIA? What do you understand by taking a qualitative approach based on human rights? And where do you see strengths and weaknesses of the approach? And how you would combine that approach with a quantitative one? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Elisabeth. Yes, so several questions you've asked. What I wanted to get at today is to address this challenge that we're all facing, I think, for ex-ante impact assessments. Challenges across many areas, but particularly when we want to get at the social or the sustainability aspects that are of increasing concern. And I'd like to answer the part of your question is, how can a human rights approach help us get at these aspects? And I would say my starting point is definitely a positive one, that there is increasing concern about how trade and trade rules impact different countries and different people within countries differently, and about the impact of trade and trade agreements on a range of public interest outcomes, which we could call also the Sustainable Development Goals. So this is positive. And I think I'm using the same words as Marcia when I say that I think we can do better. We're all in this quest sort of for the grail, the perfect methodology. And so in my view, using the human rights framework can inject missing elements into existing methodologies. I don't know, I can't see the slides, but if we can have the second slide here, just illustrating different human rights impact assessments that I've been involved in, and that looking at these demonstrate how the human rights dimension can be injected into other social considerations. So in this case of these two human rights impact assessments, for instance, on this slide, the human rights approach shone the spotlight on labor issues, on gender inequality issues, on environmental aspects of liberalization and other social aspects as well. I think the slide on the next slide on the EFTA Mercosur trade agreement human rights impact assessment we did, which is kind of a proto-human rights impact assessment. The purpose of us doing it was to show that rigorous methodology exists and can be applied. So in a sense, what we did was we did it part of the way, and then we said, well, to go the rest of the way, this is how it can be done, and the methodological approaches and tools are set out in that document if people are interested to know more. Again, for time reasons, I won't go into details, but for instance, just to give the example there, one of the focus areas of that exercise was to look at pressures on land and forestry resources through the lens of indigenous groups and indigenous rights. So in a sense, focusing the human rights approach, I think, can bring in by the focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized, attention to the other social and environmental, or the breadth of social, environmental, and other concerns that can arise. So I wanted to, in the short time available, if we have the next slide, there are 5 points that I wanted to talk about specifically. I may have to rush through them a little bit, but happy to answer questions afterwards, or to communicate with people bilaterally if there's interest. So the point that I just made is that human rights give the entry point through the most vulnerable and marginalized sectors of the population. And this is different from, I think, all other assessment methodologies. Even the UN Environment Programme, for instance, the trade impact assessment methodology starts from the sector of the economy that's most important, and it tends to be important in value or volume. Human rights will start from identifying those groups within the country or the countries that are most vulnerable. So if we were looking at impacts of a trade agreement on Switzerland, for instance, we would start perhaps by looking at how would these trade agreements affect youth with no qualifications or low skill. In the case of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we looked at smallholder farmers, for instance. So in other words, a human rights approach makes visible those people who might have been overlooked by the trade community and the trade policymakers. The second point where I think is human rights can be useful is it can help in the scoping and screening phases. I think everyone agrees that the broad-ranging, but the priorities have to be set. That when you do, when you undertake a ex-ante impact assessment of a trade agreement, you cannot look at the whole breadth of possible impacts. It would be, we'd still be doing the ex-ante impact assessment, probably to the end of our lives. So we really have to prioritize, and I think all methodologies agree on that. But the question is, which sectors do you prioritize? I was speaking to somebody in the Swiss government sector who was thinking about these impact analysis at the moment, and he said, yeah, but if you just choose certain sectors, again, they're open to sort of the same kind of capture, regulatory capture that you're trying to avoid through the trade, the international trade agreement. And my answer is, well, human rights offer a framework, an immutable, legally accepted worldwide set of criteria to define how we go through the scoping and screening phases and select the priority areas to focus on. Third point is the process and the process emphasis. Human rights puts emphasis on process as much as outcome. And this in a way simplifies as well, because I think one of the things that we know is that some of these very broad ranging impact assessments have not been, have been quite disappointing. Perhaps we're trying to do too much. And so the human rights emphasis on process can help overcome a number of challenges to do with depth, because we can have an audit that Radhika Balakrishnan and James Heinz and others have spoken about, a human rights audit of trade policy. And in short, it would be worth spending a whole session on this. But in short, this consists of asking whether the policy in question has consisted of action reasonably calculated to realize the enjoyment of particular rights, and process there. Participation, transparency is a key factor. Data, we all know that data is a challenge. We have much better data now than we did many years ago, as Joseph Francois said in his statement. Human rights helps us address a certain number of the issues we have about data. First of all, it reminds us that we need disaggregated data. Saying that a trade agreement will cause economic growth or increased imports or so on is just not satisfactory from a human rights perspective. We need to have the disaggregated data. However, we know that in many cases we don't have that data. That in itself, I would say, is an indicator. So for instance, if we lack this gender disaggregated data, for instance, in relation to jobs, if we don't have that data, that in itself is a human rights issue, to say, well, why haven't we been looking at these vulnerable groups? But also human rights approach, because it focuses on the qualitative and on consultations with stakeholders, and it allows for subjective perceptions, taking into account what people's values, but not values in the sense of monetary values, but what their choices are about priorities. That can we can fill the data gaps with these temporary proxies while we wait over time, hopefully to have data on that particular missing area in the future. We can also use proxies if we're looking at a specific country and we don't have the data there. We could use similar populations in other countries, and that's what we did in the African Continental Free Trade Area Human Rights Impact Assessment, which was quite useful. And I think yes. So just one point in that, and I think one thing that we're lacking in impact assessment is that And one thing that makes it hard to do ex-ante impact assessment is that there's a lack of ex-post impact assessment. So in a sense, having a lack of data now, we can advance still with the ex-ante impact assessment from the human rights or other perspective, but saying when we come to the ex-post assessment, we need to explore, it sort of signals what the content of an ex-post assessment needs to be. And my fifth point, very briefly, is this question is, there is a shared legal basis. I know that when the question is who carries out an impact assessment? Is it the government? Should it be an independent agency? Should it, who should it be? And also wherefore, the Canada gender-based analysis is for Canadian women, for instance. The EU sustainability impact assessments tend to focus more on the partner, the non-EU countries. The fact that the human rights, the international legal framework for human rights is applicable to the whole world. Basically, every country has ratified at least one of the major international human rights instruments, means that it's not imposing, a sort of, let's say in this case, a Swiss value on Brazil, say. So those are my main points, and the 3 points that I, the three key points I hope that people will take away from this is firstly that human rights impact assessment is an approach and a process that can inform all other kinds of impact assessment. Secondly, the human rights framework directs our attention to those who most need it, the vulnerable and marginalized groups who are often forgotten. And thirdly, human rights impact assessment does not face either more or less methodological challenges than other methodologies. And in fact, it can help overcome some of these methodological challenges.
Thank you, Caroline. Also for pointing at the importance of how the question is framed. Now, what exactly is the impact assessment for? What do we need to find out? Whether it's rather impact on sectors, on all kind of different economic sectors, or is it rather impact on very vulnerable groups in all trading partners? And the human rights framework kind of presenting and providing a framework for putting these questions right and or putting them more specifically. Thank you very much for this nice input, Caroline. Now we have 2 discussants. Let me first invite Dominik Ledergerber. He's an advisor at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO. And after having worked on international labor affairs and business and human rights at the multilateral level, he has focused on preferential trade agreements, first at EFTA Secretariat and now at SECO. And he's also involved in Switzerland, has started to do such impact assessments. He has been involved in these processes. Dominik, may I ask you to comment on what has been presented from a Swiss perspective first? And in the very recently published official strategy of external economic affairs of the government of Switzerland, the government states that it will engage in the future in ex-ante impact assessments of trade agreement and including environmental, social and economic aspects, and combine both qualitative and quantitative approaches. If you also can say a word on that process and where it stands. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, and thank you all to all presenters for the very interesting, very dense presentations. I will try to give a few reactions and comments to those, but we'll also maybe start with an answer to your last question, Elisabeth, on the process in Switzerland where we stand at. Indeed, in the new strategy for the foreign economic policy that the Federal Council has adopted last week, we commit, or Switzerland commits, Federal Council commits to undertake targeted ex-post or ex-ante and ex-post impact assessments of trade instruments, so not only of FTAs, of trade instruments. And we're also working already as a mandated by Parliament on a report to develop or to define, as you call it, a dynamic and flexible approach to such assessments for our FTAs. We're working on this report. I expect it to be published next year. And to inform our work on this, in this regard, we have mandated the OECD to conduct a review of existing methodologies of ex-ante impact assessments for FTAs. And a little publicity window here. The OECD has finalized this report in October and it has been published. So this might also be interesting for participants of this session. And I'm happy to share the link with organizers and ask them to forward it to participants afterwards. So this is the work we're undertaking. Obviously, this comes out in this OECD study, is also already recognized in the strategy of the Federal Council. If you want to do impact studies that go beyond what we have done within the EFTA Mercosur context, then you will have to combine quantitative and qualitative methods. We also will always a bit depend on what we will outsource these studies obviously to experts. We will depend a bit on what is on offer. But it's clear, I think, that a smart combination of this two types of methodologies is necessary, and I found very interesting Marcia's points on how qualitative research or how qualitative research and methodologies can then influence also the quantitative models, and I think that's a very promising approach. Now, as I say, we'll use both methods. I would still argue that sustainability effects of FTAs are a consequence of the trade and economic effects of this agreement that the agreement triggers. So if there's not a hierarchy as such between methodologies, there's still I would say a logical sequence that you start with an analysis, maybe a quantitative analysis of these trade flows and economic effects of the agreement. Obviously, as Marcia said before, this can already be the model used can already be informed by qualitative research. And then based on this quantitative first analysis, you would then choose first the issues you would like to further analyze, and then the methodologies adapted to that. I think the issue we are looking at in Switzerland and the concern or our priority is a bit to really focus this analysis on the actual effect of the FTA in question. Public discussions on FTAs are always a bit maybe hijacked or influenced also by general concerns, general discussions about globalization as such, about the effects of trade liberalization, and so on, also by national policy, if you want. And I think it's important in this assessment to choose a methodology in a way as to allow to really capture the effects of the agreement as such, and not to engage then in this bigger discussion. And here again, we obviously feel comfortable with the experience we have done we've made in the EFTA Mercosur context, where we had a quantitative assessment, but limited to this environmental effects. And here, I think we can guarantee that it's really the effects of the agreements. We will now have to expand this a bit and learn also to use other methods, and also how to use qualitative methods to the same effect, while ensuring that we can actually measure the effects of the agreement. And I think the time is already up. Before concluding, maybe one last question also, as well to the presenters. I think one promising route that we're seeing here is, and I mentioned in the beginning that we're looking at ex-ante and ex-post impact assessments, are these ex-post impact assessments. I think it would help also in our case of an open but medium-sized economy, where trade agreements, as the EFTA Mercosur example shows, might not have this large effects on trade flows, to look at existing agreements to make maybe an ex-post impact assessments, and then to identify actually through which channels these agreements affect sustainability dimensions, in order then to inform as well the design and the selection of topics to be analyzed in the next ex-ante impact assessment. So I would maybe ask also a panelist if there's time for that, to quickly react to that, and to maybe comment on this relationship between the ex-ante and ex-post assessments, and the circular nature of this whole assessment exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for this interesting insight into a Swiss process, which is taking up the endeavor to do impact assessments beforehand and afterwards. We have not talked now about timing of the assessments, something which has been raised also by Joe, when the assessments needs to be taken. Another question would be, which is now a bit in the room, whether it just depends on the question and how you frame the question, what kind of impacts you'd like to look at. For example, whether a trade agreement will support positive and rather hinder negative dynamics. And once you have the right question, you can just include it in a model, or whether a qualitative approach, as presented by Caroline, includes more, such like the process of doing the impact assessment, includes stakeholders, to have them engaged in the process of doing the analysis. So this would be a second question. Maybe Rashmi, our second discussant, has some questions, some responses to these questions and others. I am enlightened to invite you, Rashmi Banga. You are a senior economic affairs officer at the unit of economic cooperation at UNCTAD, and Rashmi has provided policy support to more than 30 countries in different functions. She has a huge expertise in this area, and she received her doctorate from Delhi School of Economics, specializing in development economics, international economics, and econometrics. You are an expert in South-South cooperation, digital issues, and assessment of trade agreements, among others. May I ask you to reflect on the questions I've just raised and on what you have heard from the other presenters from a UNCTAD perspective and from your perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Elisabeth, and thank you to the presenters for very insightful presentations. We are working very closely with policymakers, and we are especially in the developing countries, and we are sensitizing them in terms of assessments of FTAs. And as we have heard, both quantitative and qualitative aspects of FTAs are very important. And if you, I would like to reflect on the first presentation on the use of CG modeling. Again, we have, we have really discussed this with the policymakers that their entire assessment of an FTA should not depend on one kind of modeling, and especially if it is just the CG modeling. Because the policymakers need to be aware of what are the underlying assumptions of the model. In many cases, the CG models have very unrealistic assumptions. They assume perfect competition, and they assume away monopolies. And we know in digital world today, there exists a lot of, many monopolies are existing. They also assume full employment of labor and capital, perfect mobility of labor and capital, with across sectors, while we know that this really is not realistic. They also assume that government budgets are always balanced. That means if there is a decline in tariffs and a decline and consequently a decline in tariff revenue, then that can be compensated by increasing taxes. Now that may be true for developed countries, but for developing countries, this really does not hold true. And the policymakers need to be aware of what are the underlying assumptions of CG models and how these assumptions have been taken into account by the model that they are relying on. Now, coming specifically to the the presentation that was made on the EFTA, my question would be that this model uses the base data of 2014. And then the simulations are done for 2040. Now, first, to what extent is 2014 data relevant today in 2021? And second, the CG models are really giving the long-term impact. But what about the short-term impact? So this is one of the, one of the areas which policymakers really need to be aware of. And the second and the third presentation today highlights this, that the adjustment costs of trade agreements need to be taken into account. It should not be just the long-term impact. So what will happen in 2040? But between 2020 to 2040, what will be the impact on gender? What will be the impact on human rights? So all these areas and aspects, really, if you don't take them into account, you're overestimating the gains from the FTA. Then my question would also be on the kind of aggregation that is being used in the study, because trade takes place at 8-digit level, product level. And CG model has, many aggregated sectors. For example, it has leather products, but leather products include footwear, it includes leather car seats. So there are many products within that broad aggregate leather products. And the carbon emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions which have been considered, that has been considered at activity level. Now, if just to give you an example, if a country is exporting a lot of foot, let's say within the footwear, the upper soles, which uses very little leather, and because of an FTA, the exports of foot soles increases, or upper foot soles of the footwear increases. Now that is taken into the leather products, and then the carbon emissions of the leather product activity is undertaken. So how close are we to the reality? And based on this results that, okay, because it is a leather product, because the activity is increasing, so carbon, the CO2 emissions or the GHG emissions are increasing, so we should not be importing more of this. So
one more minute, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this needs to be taken into account. And my last question would be, what about the transport costs? You know, transport costs are actually included in the imports. So when you're looking at the carbon emissions, so between, let's say, Switzerland and between Mercosur, the transport, the carbon emissions because of the transport might be much higher compared to the transport cost or the GHG emissions if Mercosur is importing from a country nearby, not Switzerland. So are these kind of issues are also taken into account in the analysis, and how can the analysis really just ignore these kinds of issues? So thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rashmi, and your very precise questions on whether the modeling approach really reflects what you find on the reality, and at which extent it needs to be complemented or done in a different way. Thank you very much. And this discussion here is a very technical discussion, and another question could also be how to make people understand what analysts are doing. So how to translate into another language so that policymakers can capture the content of those studies. I'm pretty sure that all panelists would have a question to address to each other or comments, but time is very limited. So this is why I'd like to open first to the audience and ask the audience to come in with questions and comments. So if you'd like, you can or raise your hand and unmute yourself. I don't see all of you, or you put your question in the chat. Just a moment. Is there, or maybe you put first in the chat if you would like to say something. There is some comment from Marian Ketunen. Marian, you're from the test forum. Would you like to come in, please, and explain what your comment?
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yes, fantastic. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for fantastic speakers and insights from everybody, and also this event in general, which is really, really good and timely. So my name is Marian Ketunen. I am a senior policy advisor for the Forum on Trade, Environment and SDGs, test forum in Geneva. But having said that, my question or my comment comes actually from my previous work that I did more in the EU context, where I was leading the guidance that EU has now put together to look at the biodiversity ecosystem impacts of EU SCAs or EU FTAs in a context of EU sustainability impact assessments. And I just wanted to very much echo what's been said around this virtual table here of the combination of qualitative and quantitative assessments. And that is basically what I put in my chat. So when we develop this guidance, how to better look at more systematically biodiversity ecosystem impacts of FTAs in the EU context, but applies also more broadly, we very much came to the conclusion that it needs to be a combination of qualitative and quantitative assessments. So we used qualitative framework to do screening, to do scoping. Then we moved on to identifying through that the priority impacts for which you would then use quantitative modeling using modeling chains. So you start with the GTA, but then you move on to biodiversity modeling if you have resources. And then you bring all that back into more qualitative assessments and quality framework to interpret your results in the end. Just to say that, you know, so this is one source of the, how is it, a concrete impact where this has and can be done in a biodiversity space, which I hope supports the conversations we're having today, where when we want to be taking these type of assessments further forward in the future in different spaces. And just to finish off, I very much want to say that looking at this work in the biodiversity context, we identified already, and even more so now, that there are lots of synergies and benefits looking at this together, for example, with the human rights and more social side, because that also, you know, provides you a good understanding as to what kind of safeguards need to be put in place for both elements to basically have the best solution for both as well. So that's just basically my short intervention to really support what has been said by everybody and say that it also can be done and has been also used in EU context now. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcia, and for raising this very important point. I guess all the different communities dealing with the impact assessment issue from different angles can learn from each other. So it's very relevant what you have raised. Thank you very much. If you can put the link to the guidelines you've mentioned in the chat, that would be helpful. Thank you. So there is another question in the chat by Thomas. Would you like to ask a question by yourself, or shall I read it? So I will read it. How will the introduction of carbon border adjustment mechanisms be reflected in sustainability impact assessments, in particular as regards the calculation of greenhouse gas emissions? Joe, this question might be directed to you if you'd like to respond, please.
Okay, the other questions that have come up before, should we go ahead and sort of tackle
you
those
can
now,
just
yeah.
respond to this question first.
Okay.
On border tax
so
adjustments.
This one, basically on border tax adjustments, there's a need to do impact assessments on the border tax adjustments themselves before we then integrate them with impact assessments and other things, right? If you look at the EU proposal, they have a range of methods for calculating the border taxes that include things like regional supply chains, information on what's going into stuff, or just calculating, like from dumping would be BIA, so calculating an average rate based on what's being done within the single market. So anyway, there's a need to look at that. The way those will be done over time appears to be that it will involve information on cross-border supply chains, which is again back to something we need to take into account. And then you want to put those kinds of things in the models, right? So back when and now it's binding again, but in the years early on where for a while it looked like the European emissions trading system was going to be binding, right? That would have gone into the model assessments, and we can do that, right? So you can, and another advantage of having the multi-sector structure, despite the disadvantages, is you can then have this competition for carbon credits and paying for those as well. But yeah, you need to integrate those into the assessment. But I think also, to follow up on Thomas's question, there needs to be assessments of the impact of those taxes too, right? I think that there's a need to understand how those are going to work. So, okay.
Thank you. I hope this question has been responded to. There's another very nice question in the chat by Schwartz. Looking back at years of experience with ex-ante impact assessments, do we have an idea of how well they predicted the future? Whether they are a sort of an ex-post assessment of ex-ante assessments? Who would like to take this one?
Can I jump in on that first, if that's okay?
Yeah,
because we just wrapped up with the EUI in Florence, an H2020 project looking at what's called non-trade policy objectives in trade agreements, right? And that's ex post. So it has meant looking at indicators of outcomes, trying to map those onto provisions in agreements, trying to see whether we've identified effects or not. One disconcerting thing is that for the most part, notwithstanding that you see these provisions and agreements, you don't see much impact. It may be because of lack of enforcement, but it does mean that in a sense, apart from what we're talking now about qualitative and quantitative analysis, we need to sit down and look at the language, look at what's gone into different agreements specifically, and see if different ways in which things have specified have worked or not. right? Whether enforcement mechanisms have worked or not. And at least broadly speaking, it looks like there hasn't been much of an impact. And this is using a broad range of indicators on socioeconomic outcomes, environmental outcomes, and so on. The other way in which the ex-post assessments are being done is, well, okay, so for trade itself, you know, we've got all the gravity literature and the econometrics telling us what the volume impacts are. And the models do pretty well in economic effects. But these other things are much more difficult to trace through. It doesn't look like we see much of an effect. And I'm kind of a pessimist there that what we've done so far works. But I think that really we need to engage lawyers more in the ex-post assessments. We actually need to look at what's in the provisions, how those vary across different country pairs, if we've seen some result from those or not. Okay, I'll shut up.
Thank you, Joe. Someone else who would like to respond to this question? Yes, Rashmi, please.
Actually, Elisabeth, I would like to respond to the earlier question on CBAM and its impact, because from UNCTAD, from the trade division, we have just come out with a report. That report actually uses the CG model to look at what will be the impact of CBAM on developing countries. And just to share a few results of that report, the report shows that introduction of CBAM can lead to a decline in global real income by $3.4 billion. Exports of EU increases, while exports of developing countries will decline. Welfare of developed countries increase by $2.5 billion, while developing countries' incomes fall by $5.9 billion. So if you look at the distributive effect of CBAM, I would encourage everyone to look at that report. But again, as I said, that there are limitations of CG models, but even by applying CG models, you do have a very adverse distributive effect of EU CBAM. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone else, Caroline?
I think Remy is here. I wanted to flag
hello.
this interesting project taking place within Switzerland, but since Remy is here, he can probably present it better than I can.
Okay, Remy, please. I've not seen that you were here. Please, we'd like to invite you to present your project you're actually having at the University of Zurich.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm sorry I had a priority last minute and I could not attend starting the meeting. Just to say that we opened a reflection platforms in the University of Zurich with the interdisciplinary research group on global changes and biodiversity. And we try to think on methodology for assessing the impacts of free trade agreements on biodiversity and ecosystems, combining quantitative and qualitative methods. We base our discussions on the report by Marcia Fontana for the IEEP, but we try to open up for to a more inclusive method with more interdisciplinary and more transdisciplinary knowledges. We'll do that also probably at the World Biodiversity Forum. We just submitted to do a workshop, a half-day workshop. We'll welcome everyone to discuss how can we better assess the impact on biodiversity. And I share with you the link to Marion reports and to my email. And if you would like to join the discussion at the World Biodiversity Forum, it's going to be on Monday, 27th of June, and we'll probably organize something hybrid. So you're free to email me if you have any interests and would like to join these discussions on assessments of biodiversity. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Remy. Since there are no further question in the chat. This gives me the opportunity to ask the panelists if you like to react to what the others have said. There are some questions which are still open, whether, for example, for the process, whether it's important to include all kinds of stakeholders in the impact analysis. So to, as Caroline has mentioned, to have a subjective perception also included. Another question would be whether everything can be packed into a model, and how the initial question must be framed. Is it to look at vulnerable strata of the society, or is it what is exactly the aim of the impact assessment, in order not to have just an exercise out there which is not included in the end in a trade agreement? What is the aim of the impact assessment in order to frame it in a very specific and effective way? But if I'd like to hand over to the panelists so they can react to each what has been said, and if you have new thoughts, please come in. Who would like to come in at this stage? Caroline?
Yes, just to pick up on two of the points that the questions that were posed, and I really wanted to thank all the other speakers, or Dominic and Rashmi, and of course the two who spoke before me, because it's very, very interesting food for thought. In terms of the entry point, should it be the vulnerable sector, people or others? I think it's important to consider both, and the reason why is twofold. Dominic referred to the fact that the trade policy making process or debate around it could be hijacked by different people and can sort of get off track. But I think that's an important point. I think we know that trade policy is not just about economics, it's also about the politics of it. And I wanted to give an example from one human rights impact assessment that I was asked to do. And the reason I was asked to come in was because a trade negotiation had been hijacked. A group of civil society literally was sort of blocking, physically blocking the negotiations, because they were concerned it was to do with trade and services, and a lot of the civil society were very concerned this would mean water privatization, the kind of things that the sort of public interest concerns. And so I was called in sort of as an emergency to say, oh, can you look at this more closely? And I did, and carrying out the interviews with the stakeholders and the vulnerable groups, what I saw, and with the government and the industry, was that actually there was a lot of misperception on the civil society perspective. They hadn't really understood what the issues were, and that's why they were actually concerned about things that were just non-issues. But similarly, the people in business and the government sector hadn't realized how far actually it was the trade and services agreement, how far the sort of deregulatory aspect could go. So in a sense, my main takeaway, and very unexpectedly from that human rights impact assessment, was that it was worth it just for the dialogue that was engaged, and by the getting into the facts and away from kind of the myths about the agreement and into the actually this is what's happening. And maybe Joseph, this is the point that you made about the beef in the EFTA agreement as well. If those facts can be out there sooner, then you can move forward with the real issues. And in terms of, again, sort of, should all stakeholders be involved, or should it be the most vulnerable, or the people who are actually doing the trading, the businesses and so on? I think it's important to involve both, because often the trade-offs are not made clear. Any kind of policy choice is going to involve a trade-off. Clearly, somebody's going to, quite often somebody's going to lose, somebody's going to win, and then over the long term you hope that it'll sort of come back in some kind of fairness. But quite often these trade-offs, who's going to win, who's going to lose, are not made explicit, and this is why it's important to really let the voices of all be heard.
Thank you, Caroline, and sorry that I had to stop you because I have little time, and Dominic wanted to say something, and then Joe. If I can give the last word then to Rashmi and Marcia, then we can conclude the panel. Dominic, please.
Thank you. Just quickly to react to Caroline. Obviously, it's a good point, and I regret using the word hijack a little bit, but it's of course a two-way street. If you want to have an informed discussion about trade agreements, you also have actually to inform the public about what you're doing in trade agreements and how they work. And I think there's a point to be made to have a certain degree of confidentiality in negotiations, also to have trust in negotiations, to be able to try out some solutions and such. But this being said, I think there's a long way to go also for us to ensure better transparency, better communication with stakeholders throughout the process, about the intentions in negotiations, about the progress of negotiations, and then also about the results. And that's also something that figures quite prominently in this strategy of the Federal Council I mentioned last week. I think there we have some way to go, but we're obviously working on that and trying to improve the information in order then also to have a more informed discussion about such agreements going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. I think for those that don't know Swiss political system so well, we have in recent times we have had referendums on trade agreements. This makes it so interesting in Switzerland that people talk about trade agreements and need to be informed, and this also increases the need to rationalize debate. Joe, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I know that we're burning through time really fast
Mm-hmm.
here. Just to reinforce the last two sets of comments, the information sharing and gathering process is a really critical part of this whole thing, right? Whether it's modeling, and so it's the information that goes into it that actually is 90% of the value. The consultations, I think, public consultations at the beginning of the process, if I look at what the EU has done, it's useful. It helps you identify those interests that you might not, those interests that economically may not matter, but for other dimensions, they really do. And that's a chance to try and identify them. So I think scoping things out before you get into really locking into a certain framework for discussion is important. And that involves public consultations. It's beyond just qualitative, it's listening to some extent, but it's also asking civil society to listen, right? I mean, it does run both ways, but those consultations at the beginning are a good part of the process when it's done properly. On the modeling technical questions, I'll just leave that. So,
okay, thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. So I think I also learned today that this scoping is very important, and the way how you frame the question in the beginning, and what I also feel that the human rights framework can help to frame the questions very, very precisely, and that you need kind of an interdisciplinary team to approach impact assessments and do them in a way that they are informative for the public. Can I give a last word to Marcia and Rashmi, and then we conclude the panel, but please be very brief. Thank you. Who would like to be first? Marcia?
I can start very quickly, just actually to reinforce your two last points. One on, yes, we certainly cannot pack everything in a model, but there's no reason why we cannot use a human rights lens to change the way it's changed assumptions in the model, to give much more attention to distributional issues. In terms of process, the second point, the many interesting points were made around public consultations, having more inclusive stakeholder consultations. But I also think, like you just said, Elisabeth, it's very important to put more effort in ensuring there's greater diversity in the skill set of the team which carries out sustainable impact assessment, because if not, they won't be able even to take on board what emerges from consultation with stakeholders. And my experience, sadly, is that a lot of the people within carrying out this assessment are fairly conventional economists.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marcia. And Rashmi, you have the last word.
Yes, thank you so much. I would just like to say, or maybe add, that FTA assessment has to be an inclusive process, because everyone gets impacted by an FTA, whether as a producer, consumer, employer, or as an employee. So it has to be an inclusive process, and wide stakeholder consultations need to be done. Media needs to be sensitized, and it has to be, and I don't know if in many countries referendum cannot really be very successful, but it is very important to take all aspects into considerations and not just rely on just some econometric models. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmi. And this refers back to the question on why we do trade agreements, what we'd like to get to with a trade agreement, whether we'd like to strengthen kind of good procedures and good dynamics which are out there, and rather not strengthen bad ones, so hinder them, or whether we just try to find out whether this trade agreement which is on the table what kind of impact it will have, or whether we'd like to find out what kind of other trade regulation could be more conducive. So this is basically the basic question beyond the impact assessment exercise. And thank you very much for being here and for reflecting on how to improve on methodologies and improve on interdisciplinary work in this area. And thank you very much also to Switzerland for taking up this and engaging in this exercise. Thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Goodbye.